I welcome you to this CEC lecture series. I am Nupur Chawla, teaching English literature at Maitri College, Delhi University. And today I am here to discuss with you about yet another essay in the ongoing series on feminism. So, in this lecture series, we have been taking up texts by different feminists, particularly essays that were written at different points of time. So far, we have looked at the 19th century essays, and today we are going to transition to the 20th century, where we look at this the work of this very seminal women's rights activist, that is Evelyn Reed. And the title of today's lecture by that is Feminist Essay, The Myths of Women's Inferiority. Now this text, as the title itself suggests, The Myths of Women's Inferiority, is actually the title of the essay written by Evelyn Reed. So before we go into the details of this particular text, but let's first understand a little bit about Evelyn Reed. Now Evelyn Reed was an American women's rights activist, and she was born in 1905 and was around till 1979. So what do we see? We see that she was active in the 20th century. So as we are aware that feminism is a movement that was active at different points of time in history. So different centuries actually witnessed feminism as a concept differently. So likewise, Evelyn Reed then is associated with the 20th century feminism. All right. Now, we need to keep in mind that Reed actually wrote extensively, even as she was also doing this groundwork, and she was very, very active during the women's movement in America in 60s and the 70s. So you see, all the ideas that one will find in her essays then are not just theoretical thoughts of hers, but at the same time we also see her very actively participate in the feminist movement as well, right? So the text, of course, which is in discussion today is just one of the many. And you see, I have on purpose, I would like to draw your attention to the various other very interesting essays that have been written by Reed. And let's just very quickly take a look at the title of these essays. So the first one is Problems of Women's Liberation. Right. So as the term itself suggests, the problems of women's liberation. So she is looking at the different aspects of the questions of women's liberation. The next one is women's evolution from matriarchal clan to patriarchal destiny. Now this second essay is very, very interesting, where she seems to be charting some kind of a trajectory of a women's position in society, whereby initially she was associated with a clan that was matriarchal in nature. Matriarchal as in where the center of the family structure is supposed to be the woman, right? So she is saying from matriarchal clan to a patriarchal destiny, and patriarchal meaning where it's the man who's the head of the different structures. So it's like she is charting this journey from some kind of a matriarchy to a patriarchal setup, right? So that's what she takes up in this other essay of hers, which also then seems to be equally interesting, because very few people talk about the idea of clans that were matriarchal, and that's what makes her engagement very interesting. A third work by her is titled is Biology, a Woman's Destiny, right? So you will notice that how the titles of her essays or her speeches are extremely telling. So in this third one, where she seems to be posing a question, is biology a woman's destiny, also kind of engages with a very important question which has been constantly a part of the debate around women's position. That is, that is to do with biology, that is to do with society, and the question of the fact that are women, by nature made, somewhat inferior to men. That has been the dominant discourse in a lot of patriarchal, so to say, thought processes. And Evelyn Reed then in this essay is, contending with that. And yet another essay by her is again very important, and it's titled Cosmetic Fashions and the Exploitation of Women. So you see now the word over here, exploitation of women and fashions and cosmetic, very clearly shows that how she is talking about women vis-a-vis the commercial or the consumerist culture, right? So this in fact also helps us establish one of the very important aspects of Evelyn Reed, that is that she is a Marxist feminist, right? So you will notice that is what also gives an edge to what she is talking about, that is that she approaches the women's question from a materialist standpoint, right? So that is her entry point, or that is the framing, you can say that that one notes of her arguments when she discusses about the women's question. All right. So these are some of the important certain other titles by the writer that I thought you might want to also look at. But today in discussion is this essay that she wrote in 1954, and it's titled The Myth of Women's Inferiority. Now again, like all other essays by her, even this particular one has a very telling title. First, of course, is the word myth, right? So we see that in this essay, she is going to contend with some of the existing understanding, the existing thought processes, the existing ideas, or the existing biases, associated with women, right? So that's the foremost thing, that she's going to contend with the existing ideas, and hence the use of the word myth. And then she says that it's not any myth, but it's the myth of women's inferiority. Now you see how point blank she mentions in the very title of the essay itself that she's going to talk about, or she's going to engage with the question of women's inferiority, and she calls that a myth, right? So why, what is this myth of inferiority surrounding women? That is something that she is going to engage with. Okay. Now also over here, I want you to understand that that there's a very conscious use of the word myth. Right now, myth is also brings to our mind a sense of not just any idea, but an idea that has been passed on over generations, just like myths is passed on over generations, right? And also the fact that it is widespread, the fact that it is part of not just a society, but also a people's culture as well. So the term myth then is very, very loaded in this context, and kind of gives us an entry point, or actually helps us approximate what Evelyn Reed could actually be talking about in this particular essay of hers, right? So with this kind of an opening remark, I would like to move on to highlighting the four important arguments that she makes in this in the first part of her essay. Now again, before I go on to enumerate the arguments, I want to make this clear that this is a essay which is kind of longish, and it has different sections. So in today's discussion is going to be the first part of the essay, where she kind of builds her argument, and then that crux of the argument is further elaborated upon in the other part of her essay. All right. So when we look at this initial aspect of her text, we notice four important points that she seems to be making through the essay, and then these important points are are then eventually elaborated upon by Evelyn Reed. So the first point that she makes is that the class society is male dominated. That's the opening remark that she begins with, that a class society is male dominated. Now, what does she mean by class society? How does she draw the connection between these two elements? That is something that we are going to look at when we discuss at length this aspect of the argument, right? Now, the second argument that she makes is that where she mentions about the myth of male superiority and female inferiority. That is the second point of engagement by Evelyn Reed in this essay, where she talks about, as I was just now also discussing, and as the title also suggests, that she talks about some kind of a myth which establishes male superiority and female inferiority, right? So how do these two concepts of inferiority and superiority function, and how they get closely entwined with one's gender in that sense? That's something which Evelyn Reed elaborates upon, and we are going to look at length what exactly is she trying to say in this part of the argument, right? The third point that she makes is that where she discusses the problematic of motherhood in this essay. All right. Now, motherhood as a concept is very, very important. It's very, very seminal to any discussions of the women's question, right? So, what is the problematic that she talks about? Okay, that is a third point that will be in discussion today from her essay. And the fourth is where she talks about the mother as a producer procreatrix. Now, what do we mean by the term producer procreatrix? It actually identifies, or it kind of represents a kind of a continuum that Evelyn Reed is trying to establish with respect to the role played by women in the domestic sphere. All right. So these are going to be the four major points of discussion that we'll take up for analysis today, and these are the arguments that also Evelyn Reed makes in the essay. All right. So let's begin with the first idea, where she says the class society is male dominated. Now, the foremost thing that we need to understand is that what exactly is class society? What does she mean by that? So it is basically a society which is divided into different classes, okay? And this, she says, is essentially unequal. So a class society which is divided into various classes, which divides the population or people or the body politic into different classes, is, according to Reed, essentially unequal. Now, what are these classes? You see, now these classes are actually the divisions which are made on the economic lines, okay? And if you remember, as I was telling you, that Reed is a Marxist feminist, so that is that's the kind of understanding which also frames her argument. So she says, so she is actually beginning with this mention of the fact that how male domination then is a factor in a class society, okay? Now, she actually states that inequality between men and women has persisted at different points in history. So when she looks back at the class society, or society which was divided along the lines of class, she notices that since the very beginning of this kind of a social framework which was so divided along the lines of class, she says that one can notice that there was an inequality between men and women at different points in history of such a class society. And while talking about this, she particularly mentions these three important phases in history. First, she talks about the chattel slavery. Second, she talks about feudalism, and third, she mentions capitalism. So you see, these three are the social structures then that seem to frame the class society. So if we very quickly look at that, how did these social frameworks kind of divide the society? The first one being the chattel slavery. Now, what is chattel slavery? It was basically as we all are aware that America and particularly the southern states in America were slave owning states, right? And America has had a history of slavery, which of course was then abolished by Abraham Lincoln at the end of the Civil War. But then, so chattel slavery divided the population into slaves and the slave owners, right? So the whites were supposed to be the slave owners, and the slaves, of course, were supposed to be the African Americans. Now, what does the word chattel over here mean? That basically shows that how women who were slaves then, they were forcefully made to give birth. They were forcefully made to kind of have more children. Why? Because that was then considered to be a source of generating more slaves. All right. So initially, as we all are aware, that slavery started with the transportation of the African Americans to Africans to America, who then were used as slaves, or who were then deployed as slaves. But after a certain point of time, this kind of a travel or transit was restricted, or it was not allowed. But there were still some sections that continued to have this kind of a conviction in slavery. So that is how that gave rise to chattel slavery. So where women were then forcefully made to have children, so that the children of those slave women could further be used as slaves, right? So that is the first instance that Reed points towards when she talks about this kind of class society that gave rise to inequality amongst men and women. Okay. Likewise, now feudalism was a social setup where there was a owner of the land, right, the landlord, and then there were the those who would be working on the land, or the peasants. So this kind of a division then, so during feudalism, this was the social division between the landlord and the peasant that would be working on the land, and the profit of the land would go to the landlord, while the person who's actually working, that is the peasant, would merely be a source of physical labor in that sense. So that is another a kind of a class society that Evelyn Reed mentions. And after that comes the most recent then aspect of class society, which is capitalism. Now, in capitalism, of course, what is the division? The division is between a worker, or the proletariat, and the owners of the means of production, that is the capitalist, right? The person who has the resources, the person who has the money, runs the factories, runs the industries, and then in turn hires the proletariat, right? So that is the very basic model of class division in capitalism as a social framework. So you see, Reed then states that with such a society that is segregated along class lines at different points of time in history, so starting with chattel slavery, leading on to feudalism, and then finally capitalism, she says that such a social framework is supposed to be the root of the injustice even between men and women. All right. So from here, she makes a very a closely associated point, where she says that male domination was perpetuated by systems of private property, state, religion, and the family, all of which served men's interests. So now she helps us understand that how did class society become essentially male dominated. So she gives us the logic behind it. She says that all the systems, be it of private property, that was during capitalism, this framework of the state, the framework of religion, and even for that matter, family, the structure of family, all these time and again at different points in history seemed to have served the interests of men. Okay, so that is what she pegs as the root of so to say a male domination in class societies. Now you see, if we wonder that this kind of a understanding of male domination and the inferiority of women in that sense is not only restricted to the realm of ideas, okay, so it actually percolates down to the very structure, to the very constitution of the different aspects of society, and that is what Evelyn Reed is pointing towards. So it is not only restricted to prejudices, it is not only restricted to certain ideas that are popularized at a certain point of time, but what Reed in this argument is doing is that she is going into the very fundamental aspect of what has perpetuated male domination at different points of time, and she then for that purpose comes to a state that it is the way society is structured, this kind of a division which exists in society, that becomes the root cause of male domination and thereby subordination of women. And therefore she also expands our understanding, and she brings in the idea of private property. Now what is private property? Private property means where property is not owned by the state but it is owned by individuals, right? So the systems of private property that came with capitalism seemed to be in favor of men, right? Likewise the state, the religion and the family also, these other structures too, they did not create space for women to come into positions that were decisive, to have roles that were seminal. Instead, in all these structures, their thought processes, the kind of ideas perpetuated by these structures then, all of them seemed to reinforce the centrality of the man. So from here then, this idea of male domination then started to feel like some kind of a given fact, so to say, right? So that's what Evelyn Reed does, that she takes us into the heart of the problem. Okay, so the problem does not really lie with the people's mindset, but instead the problem lies with the constitution of society, a society which itself is divided, which has at its heart this kind of a segregation of population. So once people are segregated into say the slaves and the slave owners, the landlord and the peasant, or the capitalist and the worker, or the proletariat, so this kind of a already divisive society further encourages the distinction or the division between men and women also, right? So what we need to focus over here is that not only does she go into the fundamental causes or the reasons of this kind of an approach of male superiority, but at the same time how Evelyn Reed in her argument seems to weave so beautifully different kinds of divisions in society, right? This is what also kind of adds to the appeal of Reed's argument, that she does not only remain restricted to the status of men and women alone, and she seems to then be discussing about this kind of inequality that is not only along the lines of gender, but how different kinds of inequalities have existed at various points of time, and how one reinforces another. So thereby pointing our, bringing our attention to not just the women's question, but at the same time also making us look at the different kinds of discrimination as well, right? So that is the crux of the very first idea that she introduces in her essay, where she talks about that how class society is male dominated. Okay, now we are going to stop at that in this lecture, and we are going to discuss the other 3 important ideas that she puts forth in this essay in the second part of this lecture. Thank you.